Amazing. Thank you so much. So, Afra, thank you so much for taking the time to do this conversation. I wanted to begin with the beginning because we live in a time where more than 3 billion people play video games in the world, and what used to be a niche kind of medium or activity has become, in a way, one of the most important mediums of our time. And it's, of course, interesting how many artists also are developing video games. Now, I wanted to ask you how you came to video games, if there was an encounter you remember, or if it was a gradual process.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's more than anything else, it's just the generation that I was born in. I grew up in the 90s and, there was this sort of media multiplicity. So we were kind of like, I remember the computer came into my house when I was in maybe the eighth or ninth grade, and then it was in my room. And I would spend a lot of time just surfing the web or like looking up bizarre things, spending time in chat rooms. And we had these encyclopedia like multimedia CD-ROMs in which we would, like instead of looking at books, it would be these multimedia things about, say, dinosaurs or your body or something like this. And they would really be these interactive, like click here and something happens, or click there and, you find out something. So the sort of new advent of this technology was really like in our lives when we were growing up in that generation. And I think just video games became like an extension of that. We had these very cheap handheld um, devices where you could play Tetris, which was called the brick game. And then we would like all the kids would get together and play one by one and pass it on
Yeah.
to see who gets the highest score. So I think it was just a generation thing that brought it up. And we would spend a lot of time on the computer, not just playing video games, but games were definitely part of that. And I think maybe because that language was so like familiar to us when it became time for me to think about what I wanted to make, like unconsciously, I think I began to think in that language itself.
Thank you. Now, I was also curious because you have a very, I remember when we met first for the research for the world building exhibition, and that was really an exhibition which kind of developed out of the lockdown, because during the lockdown, we made many studio visits all over the world about artists doing video games, because I kept observing that more and more artists would work with video games. So I wanted to do an exhibition which brings this together, and it began at Julia Stoschek. Actually, it was the anniversary show, and then I curated it as well in Metz with the Centre Pompidou, with Chiara Parisi. And of course, now we're doing this special panel on on the occasion of the launch of the Khoj Marathon book with Khoj at the Indian Art Fair. Now, one thing which is interesting is that in this conversation, this first Zoom we had before you then participated in the show, you told me about your very unique style of working, where you don't come from an animation background, but you somehow bring together digital elements and hand-drawn elements. So in a way, it's almost like mixed reality.
Yeah, I think collage is very much like the principle with which all the work comes together. And I didn't really train either I mean, I studied literature, and I think books are really like the starting point for most of my works. But I think that what ends up happening and what I want to say is the sense of simultaneity, like a this and that, or while this, also this. And I think that becomes part of the form of the work, where I'm kind of pulling from multiple sources and archives and sort of using this idea of remix. And I think that the animation is an extension of those attempts in some ways. So there's a lot of collage making and bringing together. And initially, like I wasn't trained as an animator. And the reason I took to animation is because I work with a lot of archival material, but I'm interested in kind of looking at them in different ways. So I would kind of think about how can I give a different life to these existing imageries by just literally playing with them or bringing them to life. And I was sort of limited by my skill set. And so the work started sort of looking a certain way, but I think I'm more interested in what I'm trying to say rather than this sort of very produced or slickness of the logic of animation. And also I mean, there's a kind of a rich tradition of animation that's also quite handmade and kind of looks craft and low tech that I find very beautiful and feel quite inspired by. And so I think all of those things come together both as a combination of like my journey of not being trained, but also being interested in that possibility of something kind of being digital, but also physical, and that space between the two.
Thank you. Now, you've also got a very strong feminist practice, and that's, of course, very important also in relation to video games. So I wanted to kind of ask you to tell me more about that and how you use technology in a way also to visit archival imagery of women's history. I mean, in a way, it's important, I think, in this age where technology plays such a central role that we don't forget the importance of memory. And Eric Hobsbawm, the late historian, always told me it's not because we have, more and more information and access to digital images that we have more memory. Amnesia might somewhere be very much at the core of this digital age. And that's why Eric Hobsbawm kind of talked about a necessary kind of protest against forgetting. So I'm very interested about this protest against forgetting that you actually look at women's history, at their writing, and use kind of video games to do so.
I mean, I think feminism has sort of informed different ways in which I've managed to lead my life or make choices, or how I've ended up sort of carving the practice and the life that I have in relation to, say, my childhood, or where I come from, or what was expected of me. And I think that it's kind of been like a little bit of a guiding light in my way of looking at power structures around the world, etc. But it's also very much my like early years from college. I moved to Bombay as a freelancer, interested in sort of politics, but also the documentary film form. And I assisted many sort of very seminal documentary filmmakers and artists in Bombay for many years. And I think like Paramita Vora or Madhushri Datta, and I think working with other older feminist collectives, and working with, older women who were making films that were informed by a feminist practice really helped me sort of strengthen my lens around that. But I also came from a different generation, and I felt like, I was sort of grounded in the things that I learned from there, but there were also newer things that I wanted to explore or think about or bring together. And I feel like the form of the game, and it's not only video games, but it's sort of the form of this, the possibilities that the digital medium offers, or the interactive medium offers, or the world of code and the web offers to me, that I found very open and expansive. And I felt like I could really use that form to talk about all of the different experiences in a way that is both not, overly, say, lectury. It's fun, it's engaging, it's sort of playful, but without making it simplistic in terms of the ideas that it engages with. So although like technology is really kind of overtaken our lives in many ways, sometimes when I look at work that is just only about the technology, that's not really very interesting. I feel like what I'm more interested in is the ways in which technologies kind of tell us about ourselves and the way the world is organized. And what that means in terms of a sort of feminist lens is also how how the technology can kind of embrace different ways of being and seeing. The game world can be quite a masculine space of conquest and fighting and winning. And I'm kind of interested in games that aren't really about winning or losing, or maybe games that don't really have a point, or games that are that don't need you to have this dexterity of like clicking 20 controls in order to be able to play, but games that even, say, a grandmother can play. And I think this is the space of games that I find allows for a sort of feminist engagement in some way.
Thank you so much. And when we did the world building exhibition, in initially in Düsseldorf at Julia Stoschek and then at the Pompidou in Metz, where you participated, we were very inspired by Anna Antropy and this book of the rise of the video game Sinisters, which dates from 2012, where Anna Antropy writes, "What I want from video games is a plurality of voices. I want games to come from a wider set of experiences and present a wider range of perspectives. I can imagine," she writes, and you are invited to imagine with me, a world in which digital games are not manufactured for the same small audience, but one in which games are authored by you and me for the benefit of our peers. And of course, that polyphony is what is so exciting right now, also because of the accessibility of game engines. Many more artists can actually do their video games and kind of create their own world building. Another thing which I found fascinating is, of course, that very often these projects are not necessarily following the time horizon of an exhibition, They're not basically following this short-termism often, but they're actually longer durational projects. Very often, it actually takes years to make a video game. And then, as opposed to a movie, because once a movie is launched, it doesn't really change anymore. Video games keep changing. There's feedback, they evolve. And then, I mean, in a Simondon way, it's actually not only that they have feedback, which is a cybernetic idea, but they actually, almost in a biological way, as Simondon says, they kind of evolve. They become like living organisms. And what I found very fascinating in our dialogue is, of course, that you've been working for many years on Nobody Knows for Certain. It's initially a 3-year research project where you basically began to look into the exchange between the USSR and South Asia during the Cold War and sort of developed a long durational project kind of out of this dialogue. And that's what we showed in world building. And I think it would be really exciting to hear a little bit more about what prompted that work, that dialogue, and also the whole research you did over 3 years and how it then evolved and where the project stands now.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, initially, and I think that's also something that kind of is the approach for most projects. I don't start off by saying, oh, I'm making a game or I'm making a film or whatever, but it's like, I'm interested in this particular research idea and let's see where that takes me. And this was a project where I was looking at children's books from the Soviet Union that came to India. And through the process, I felt like when I saw the books, they were gorgeous, beautiful paper, beautiful illustrations, amazing stories. Some of the stories were clearly propaganda. Some of the stories were actually subverting the propaganda, and there was a lot going on. And I started by trying to build an archive of these books. So I traveled to many parts across India. It was sort of a field research grant and photographing these books and building an archive. And then I felt like, oh, I want to put this archive together for it to exist in a way that you can see this range of material, but also found so many interesting backstories from children who grew up now in their 40s, but people who were children when they grew up reading these books. Or I found some of the writers from India who lived in Moscow and, translated these books into Indian languages, or the government state, like the state policy between USSR and India that led to this kind of exchange program, etc. And I felt like all of that information informed why these books exist, and how you could kind of look at them in a different way when you have a set of the context within which they were created and distributed. And so I kept thinking of what would be an archive. I don't want to just upload these books online on a drive or something, but like, how can I house these stories in a way that it kind of recreates the feeling that I felt when I first saw them, this feeling of like wonder and magic, but also this idea of connecting the dots on the logic of the nation state, for example, or the way that citizenship is imagined in a new nation, etc. And so I thought, what better way to enter a sea of stories uh, than writing a story itself. And I started to write a story that was in the form of a matryoshka doll, like a nested story. So there's a container, and then within that, there's another story and another story and another story, and you can kind of endlessly recede into finding where the kernels are in some way. And so once I kind of arrived at that script, I realized that how, the game engine really lends itself to this form. And I decided to work in Unity, and it sort of became a more narrative game form in some sense. So it really evolved through that process. And I mean, also, it was the first time for me that although made interactive work in the past, it's mostly in HTML or in like C++, and it's more browser based. And this is the first time I worked with a traditional game engine, and it was a very steep learning curve. Games take a lot of time, a lot more resources. I was working with a programmer, game engineer, and it became a lot more expensive than I expected, And at some point I was like, oh, we can only tell half the story in the budget that we have. And then the other half of the story sort of lingers in a way that is to be realized, but hasn't really been realized yet. And I kind of think of it as part one, and then part two is coming in some way. And I think games allow you to do that. And, this particular work actually, like you're saying, the infinite possibility of tweaking or building versions. The version that we finally released, for instance, that was shown at Tasseldorf, etc., was like version 143. And so there were so many more versions before that we play tested and that we kind of evolved every time. Just by trying to like see what were our desires for the experience and how that was being translated or not, and then every time going back and tweaking things. But once the narrative was fixed, that particular game is pretty It's sort of like a closed story, and I think that now it will only expand in terms of like newer versions or newer seasons of a show in some way. But another project that I was working on about ants and like really understanding the system of ants through game making is actually a lot more expansive, because every time the game travels, we kind of collect some data, and then the next version is different. And so this is like a more open loop project that I'm still working on and started working on about 2 years ago, where we first showed it at the Dhaka Summit, and the most recent version was at the Zeppelin Museum in Germany. So it's kind of every single time we kind of get the ants out into the world, and then just based on the ways that the players kind of control and direct the colony, we understand how it's working, and then we kind of change the system's rules, or we tweak the ways in which the colony behaves and the players can interact with them. And that's been a fun and interesting process that I don't think any other medium allows you to do in this way.
Thank you. Now, for the exhibition, the world building exhibition for the book, we commissioned Jaroslav Volovod to write on your work. And in the text of Jaroslav, there is this passage about the characters, the non-conforming characters which you invent. Um, Here, the quote: "The unique blended narrative of the game is enriched with the presence of original non-conforming characters invented by the artist, such as the cat without the tail and the empty matryoshka." Can you tell us a little bit about these characters? Because obviously you use a lot of elements from the past. We can say, I mean, in many different ways, the future is invented with elements from the past in your work, but then you also create these new characters in a way who appear.
Yeah, I mean, especially for this game, because the entire game is made up of characters who are actually iconic characters in the children's books. But I wanted but these were all characters from the USSR that came to India through the books. And so they were kind of inhabiting, for the children here, these were, even though they read about them so much and they knew these characters, they had these strange names that were, Russian names, and that they ate different food that was not familiar to India. They played in the snow, they looked a certain way. And yet the children in India had this like very close connection to these storybook characters. But I wanted to introduce something from the world of India, because that's where the game is set, even though the characters are not Indian. And so I kind of thought to introduce two, and they're quite childlike, the writing in it, but I feel like I wanted to talk about slightly more like ideas of non-conformity, even though it was in a childlike way. So I kind of wrote up a character of a Matryoshka doll who's empty inside because the child has lost the rest of her set. And then what that means for somebody who's not fulfilled in some sense, and looks at stories to make a sense of who she is or what she's missing. And the other character that I wrote was about a cat who was born without a tail, and the sort of idea of a freak or somebody looking at, some what is called ajab, like a strange creature, and the way that that is perceived, but also playing on this idea of the tale and the TALE stories. And so both these characters go in search of stories for different reasons. One, both because they're missing different things, and how stories help them realize things about the world and about themselves, and that becomes then the journey of the nest. And within that, they find different characters and stories, and so that's the nested narrative.
And then we wanted to also talk about this second game, the ants game, which is in a way an open system. And in the 90s when I began to curate, I came up with this kind of open system of Do It, which is an exhibition model over time where basically, it's no longer about producing finite kind of original artworks, but it kind of disrupts the modes of art production, this, into more sort of dissemination, dispersion, and it's always different interpretation, like a very open system. Two Do It versions are never the same. And so then when I encountered, the world of video games, I was very interested in this idea of the different version, and that in a way the status of the artwork seems to change, that there is no longer an idea like of a finite artwork. The artwork keeps evolving, keeps changing. As you say, there are different versions. Each exhibition, you show it in Dhaka, you show it in different cities. It's another version. The feedback, the reaction are built in. The project continues to grow. Can you explain that a little bit with the example of ants? And also, I'm very curious about your view on this idea. If you also feel that there is a change of the status of the artwork, that it's just no longer a finite, somehow finished product, but it's something else.
Sure. Yeah, I think that the ants work was something that I started thinking about during the lockdown, because I had an ant infestation in my house. So I would just
Yeah.
watch these movements of these ants, and I felt like they were so like there was a larger sort of defining system by which they sort of functioned. And the more that I read about it, the more fascinated I got. And I kind of started learning about the histories of algorithms that were informed by ant behaviors and the ways in which computer scientists and entomologists got together with their knowledge of the insect world and the way that data functions, and how so much of the way that the internet works is based on natural processes, whether it's the growth of mushrooms or the movements of insects and ants, etc. And so I kind of thought about how much the algorithm controls our lives in the ways in which this invisible algorithm controls the ways in which ants behave. And so much of our behavior on the internet, and I look at Twitter, at that time as an example, but how much of what we feel or express or believe in the way that systems are sort of influenced by opinions on the internet aren't actually so much directed by us as we think, but larger systems that have been designed to make us behave in these ways. And I thought maybe a good way of experiencing that was to bring in something like Twitter into something like the ant colony together in an experiential way. So what I've ended up doing for the game is that we've made a simulation of ants where we've created some principles for these digital ants to behave in the way that actual ants behave, where they follow these pheromone trails and they collect food. And the stronger the trails are, the more ants go towards something, the way in which the ants communicate to each other, take materials to the nest, etc. And at the same time, I've given the players the chance to feed their thoughts to the ants. So the ants behave in the ways that actual ants in the real natural world behave, but their food are tweets or little thoughts that players feed them. And each thought has an emotion behind it. So whether it's angry or it's loving or it's whatever. And depending on what you end up feeding the ant colony, it behaves in different ways, where it generates water or fire. And so it's not just it's also an exercise in what collective impact looks like. So you enter this work and you may feed one thought to the ant colony, but there's someone else around you who has fed another kind of thought. And so collectively, what is it that the colony is being fed, and how do they behave? And once you start looking, oh, my colony is burning, do you go in there and edit out people's thoughts? Because you can reduce food, you can increase food, you can kind of manipulate the colony to do certain things if you desire. And the game is also multiple in the sense that not only do multiple people are able to control it at the same time, but also there are multiple cycles of the colony's life and death. And so because of this, every time the game is played, not only every time it travels, but every game cycle is quite different. You might walk into a room, into into the ant colony when it's quite crowded and everybody's in a bad mood, and you might see the colony functioning quite differently. Or you may walk in at some point and it's just you, and it's almost like an introspective exercise for you to see where your mind is at. And what happens the whole time is everything that people have fed the ant colony comes back to me through this sort of data collection exercise that I'm really interested in mapping, because it's a very clear indication of what people feel like in different cities. Like in Dhaka, people were mostly irritated for different reasons, and you get to see what they were irritated about. Or when the game travels to Zeppelin, it was the summer and the weather was nice and people were feeling a lot better, and so you kind of also, like, the game becomes a way to track moods, but also every time we introduce different ways in which the colony can function, write a new function of the way the ants behave. And so I feel like I haven't arrived at this answer for myself, like, what is the end of this game, or what does the resting point look like? Right now, for me, it's still in a stage where it grows and it morphs and it changes. But I think at one point it will be like, okay, these are the different phases of it, but the phases are where we rest. And I think maybe I will know at that stage, because this is the only, like, this, I think that this is the only project that I've worked on, which is an experiment for me also. Like, I don't know the end of this. Every time it goes out into the world for another show, I'm like, okay, this can also happen, or this is also possible. And I think that's what makes it quite interesting for me to keep engaging with this work again and again.
Yeah, and of course, it reminded me also of James Lovelock, the late James Lovelock, who, of course, coined the notion of Gaia. And I interviewed him when he was almost 100 years old, about the Gaia hypothesis. And he kind of, in that conversation, talked about ants as, a collective, looking at collective behavior in nature, but also ant colonies in a way as maybe analogies in terms of complex systems of self-regulation, emergent properties, all
Mhm.
of which connects to your work and kind of connects to this game. I wanted to ask you what you're working on right now. If there is a new game, what's the future?
I don't know if it's a game, but I've been quite interested in the in this early computer viruses that came in the 1980s, and especially from South Asia, viruses from Indonesia, from Pakistan, the names of the viruses, and also really looking at early hackers as sort of activists, as opposed to the way in which, tech geeks kind of collude with the nation state of today. But tech geeks of the 80s were really, using their knowledge of computer systems to co-opt and kind of take over certain dominating systems. So I'm looking at, I don't know, like a virus in Pakistan and a virus in Indonesia and this virus in Melbourne, and kind of what computer worms were called and what they ended up doing by hacking into different sort of and generating ideas of malware, and how that was systems of activism. I don't know what form that's going to take, but I've been sort of interested in that of late.
And as you know, I'm interested also in unrealized projects because we know a great deal about architects' unrealized projects because they publish them,
Mhm.
but we know very little about visual artists' unrealized projects. And of course, there can be projects which are too big to be realized, too expensive, too time intense. Sometimes it's also just projects which are forgotten, somewhere in a file or in a locker. Then it can be projects which are unrealizable. Utopic, there can be also projects which are censored. Censorship can be a reason for a project to be unrealized. Or, as Doris Lessing always told me, it can also be a self-censor project, a project one would love to do but doesn't dare to do. So within this sort of broad range of the unrealized, can you tell me about one of your favorite unrealized projects or dreams?
Sure. There's this text called Ajaib al Makhlukat wa Garaib al Majidat, which is a manuscript of strange but marvelous things. It's an illustrated manuscript from the 13th century that I've been very interested in for a long time. And they have this thing called hybrids, which is humans, animals, and plants creating one new sort of species. And I've been very interested in this idea, but I somehow don't know if I'm ready to know what exactly I'm interested in about this idea. So
Yeah.
I keep coming back to it, but it's been on the back burner for many years, and I think that yeah, that's the one for me that I
Thank
somehow
you.
not ready to make, but not ready to forget either.
Thank you. And the very last question is we're also interested, I think, in relation to the whole research for world building to, of course, know about what kind of games from the past inspire you. And I mean, I've always been hugely inspired by Hideo Kojima, whom I finally met last year for the first time. And for me, his games have been a real revelation. One of the reasons I got into, into video games. But I think it's interesting also to kind of, through that research, in a way expand the canon and learn about video games on all continents, from lots of different artists. And again, contribute also to the protest against forgetting, because sometimes amazing video games kind of have been forgotten. So I was curious if you can tell me maybe about some of your favorite video games from India, but also from anywhere in the world, which in the past and present have inspired you, but maybe also if there's any kind of recent video games, of the recent months which you really like.
I recently played an Indian video game called Palace on the Hill, which was lovely. I really liked it. It was about a young student from an art college who goes back to his village for the summer holidays, and he just wants to paint for a new show, but his village life sucks him in, and he has to help with agriculture on the farm, and so you have to keep doing many things in order to get time to paint. And it was wonderful because it was how specifically Indian it was in terms of the cultural context and the details in the game. I love Dhruv Jani Studio Olymingus's games, who you're going to also speak to as part of this session. Cat and the Coup is one of my favorite games. It's not Indian, but it's from an Irani game maker. And what else? Pippin Bar's games, I find them hilarious. I love how he looks at Greek philosophies and little play techniques. Sorry. Yeah, and I think when I was growing up, but I played like a lot of I spend a lot of time in Minecraft. I find it very soothing to build things in there. Yeah.
Great. But thank you so much. This was an amazing conversation. I'm very grateful.
Thank you. I really
And then
enjoyed
I hope to see you soon,
it.
somewhere in the world, when I
Sure.
visit India another time later this year, otherwise in Europe.
Yes, looking forward to that
Thank you
whenever.
for your time.
You. Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
All the best. See you soon. Thank you.